Nearly every detail of Noah's flood, the ark, the mountaintop landing, the dove, the sacrifice, appears in a story written over 1,000 years earlier, the same hero warned by a god, the same boat dimensions, the same birds sent to find dry land, the same altar built afterward. Scholars have identified 8 striking parallels between the biblical account and ancient Mesopotamian flood stories. But there's one difference that changes everything, and it's not what happens, it's why. 3 ancient Mesopotamian texts tell flood stories: the Sumerian account featuring Ziusudra, the Atrahasis epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh all predate the biblical text by centuries. The parallels are undeniable. In both traditions, gods deliberately decide to send a flood. One righteous individual receives divine warning. He's given specific ark construction instructions. He brings family and animals aboard. The ark lands on a mountaintop. Birds are sent to scout for dry land. The survivor builds an altar and offers sacrifice. The hero receives divine blessing afterward. 8 structural parallels, same narrative skeleton. So is the Bible simply copying an older story? Not quite. The biblical writer transforms this inherited tradition to make a radical theological argument. Here's where everything changes. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send the flood for no stated reason, pure divine whim. The Atrahasis epic does give a reason. Humans have become too noisy. They're disturbing the gods' sleep. Enlil, the chief god, can't rest, so he decides to destroy humanity. And the biblical account offers something radically different. God sends the flood because of hamas, a Hebrew word meaning violence, bloodshed, injustice, and oppression. Genesis 6:11 states, the earth was filled with violence. This isn't arbitrary divine annoyance, it's moral judgment. Noah survived specifically because he's righteous in his generation. The biblical writer insists God acts with moral justification, not caprice. The difference in motivation points to something deeper, a completely different understanding of who God is. Watch how the gods behave during the flood in Gilgamesh. When the waters rise, the Mesopotamian gods panic. The text says they cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. Ishtar, the great goddess, cried out like a woman in labor. These are the same gods who sensed the flood, now terrified by what they've unleashed. After the flood, they've gone hungry without human sacrifices. When Utnapishtim offers his sacrifice, the gods crowd around it like flies. They're desperate, dependent, and undignified. This portrayal reveals gods who don't fully control the forces they invoke. The biblical God presents a stark contrast. No cowering, no panic, no desperate hunger for sacrifice. God makes a deliberate decision, executes it with complete control, and maintains clear purpose throughout. When Noah offers his sacrifice, God doesn't crowd around it like a starving deity. He responds from a position of sovereignty, making promises about the future. The theological implication: God doesn't need sacrifice for sustenance. He's not threatened by the forces he commands. This isn't a minor stylistic difference. It's a fundamental claim about divine nature. The Mesopotamian gods are powerful but limited, subject to forces beyond their control. The biblical God exercises absolute sovereignty over creation. The moral justification for the flood connects to a broader biblical pattern. Consider who gets punished in Genesis before Israel even exists. Cain murders Abel, punished. The flood generation practices violence, destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah oppressed the vulnerable, annihilated. Notice what's absent from these judgments. These humans are condemned for religious sins, no idolatry charges, no wrong worship accusations. They're punished for moral sins, violence, murder, injustice, oppression. The radical implication: all humans, by virtue of bearing God's image, are bound to basic moral law. Right? Even if they don't know God, even if they've never heard of Israel, the image of God creates universal moral accountability. This framework explains why the flood targets Hamas specifically. Violence against other humans violates something fundamental about creation itself. Every human bears the divine image. To murder is to assault that image. The pre-Israelite world had no Torah, no covenant with Abraham, no commandments at Sinai. Yet God held them accountable. For what? Not for failing to worship correctly. They had no revelation telling them how. For failing to treat each other with basic dignity. This establishes a moral baseline that predates and underlies all later biblical law. Before there's a chosen people, there's a created humanity. Before there's a special revelation, there's natural moral knowledge written into human existence. After the flood, God establishes what scholars call the Noahide covenant. This isn't a covenant with Israel. Israel doesn't exist yet. It's a covenant with all humanity through Noah. I think of it as a second creation. Humanity gets a fresh start with explicit laws. Genesis 9 lays out the terms. First, a concession. Meat eating is now permitted. In Genesis 1, humans were vegetarian. Now, God acknowledges human appetite for power over animals. But this permission comes with a restriction. Blood must be poured out, not consumed. Why? Because blood represents life itself. The life essence belongs to God, not to humans. Even in killing for food, humans must acknowledge limits. The covenant's central prohibition addresses murder directly. Genesis 9:6 states, "Whoever sheds the blood of a person in exchange for that person, shall his blood be shed, for God made humans in his image." The logic is precise. Murder isn't wrong because society disapproves. Murder is wrong because humans bear God's image. To kill a human is to destroy something that reflects the divine. The punishment matches the crime. Life for life because the victim's life held ultimate value. This creates the foundation for all later biblical ethics. Human dignity isn't earned through achievement or granted by government. It's intrinsic, rooted in creation itself. Every human, regardless of nationality or religion, bears this dignity. The covenant concludes with a sign, the rainbow. God promises never to destroy the earth by flood again. But notice what makes this promise meaningful. In Mesopotamian mythology, divine promises can be overturned. Gods disagree, deceive each other, change their minds. A promise from one god might be nullified by another. The rainbow as eternal covenant symbol works only because the biblical God's word is absolute. No rival power can nullify it. The transformation is complete. The biblical writer takes an inherited flood tradition and rewrites its theological DNA. Same story structure, radically different meaning. Capricious gods become a just God. Divine panic becomes divine sovereignty. Arbitrary destruction becomes moral judgment. A lucky survivor becomes a righteous man. And a natural disaster becomes the occasion for universal moral law. The similarities make the differences more significant, not less. This is deliberate theological argument through narrative transformation. The flood story isn't just about what happened, it's about what kind of God exists and what kind of world we inhabit. A world where justice matters, where violence has consequences, where human dignity is intrinsic, not granted, where even after catastrophe, covenant is possible, the rainbow still appears after storms. And the moral framework established with Noah, that let every human life bears divine image, still shapes how we think about human rights today.